race fans, my name is Taylor and welcome to Above the Yellow Line, the show where we talk about all the updates, theories, news, recaps, and more of the NASCAR Cup Series. Today I want to spend time talking about some of the driver updates and of course the duels that happened last night and the outcomes of those two races and how they possibly changed my Daytona 500 predictions. I also want to end this with my championship pick of the 2021 NASCAR Cup Series season. So let's start with a few updates just to gloss over. Two updates that came out in the past few days is Kevin Harvick is signing on as the Xfinity brand ambassador. This includes the logo being on his fire suit, maybe a helmet. So there's that news. Another big piece of news from the JGR camp is that Truex extended his deal with JGR into 2022, so he will be with them for that season. So that's what's new outside of the actual racing. So let's jump into the races, starting with duel number 1. Now, the duels in general take the qualifying results from the drivers that happened on Wednesday, and it splits the field in half from those who qualified in odd-numbered positions and even-numbered positions. The qualified in the odd-numbered positions, 1, 3, 5, and so on, were in duel number 1, and the even-numbered qualifiers were in duel 2. There was 22 cars in each race. Each duel is 60 laps long, 150 miles around the track, and this is the driver's first chance to get a leg up on the rest of the field for the season. This is the first chance to score some valuable points for the season. Other important factors of this race involve the cars that are trying to still make their way into the Daytona 500. The highest finishing open car, and this means that the cars that have yet to solidify their spot in the Great American Race, not the full-time drivers, will claim their spot in the 500 as a last-minute effort to make the race if they qualify and finish high enough in the duels. I won't mention those drivers now just to keep things organized, but I will mention these specific drivers when we get into the duels because duel number 1 gets a little messy, and I'll explain why once we get to the end of that. Now, winning the duel does not automatically mean you win the Daytona 500. The last driver, and this was a shocking fact to me, to win the duel and then go to win the 500 was Matt Kenseth in 2013. But the duels do give the viewer a good idea of who is likely to struggle and who is likely to succeed on Sunday, bearing in mind that there will be some chaos and wrecks, not to mention rain. The forecast is showing rain for Sunday, and last year we had a rain delay for the 500 as well, and I just don't want to go through that. You have all this built-up excitement during the promos and the pre-race show, and it just brings down the mood when you have a rain delay, and it's just really sad. So I don't want that to happen. We did have a rain delay for the second duel last night, and we'll get to that when we talk about it. But let's start with the first duel. I'll put the starting lineup on the screen for you to see, but it's not totally accurate. Before the green flag actually waved, Tyler Reddick had to start at the back of the field due to unapproved adjustments to the car. Now at this point, I want to take a look at the 3 drivers who are trying to race their way into the Daytona 500. Another driver we need to look at is Ryan Preece, who raced his way in during qualifying based on his fastest laps time. The 3 drivers we are looking at is the 96 of Ty Dillon. We're also looking at the 33 of Austin Cindric and the 66 of Timmy Hill, hoping to make their way into the 500. So keeping those drivers in mind, the Blue-Green Vacations Duel 1 was underway. To even start, I was surprised at the cars towards the front. They did not begin 3 wide. I think they're trying to stay a little bit more cautious to keep their cars intact because these are the cars that they are bringing to the 500. So if you scrape them, you scratch them, you might have to go to a backup car, which unfortunately we did see. We'll get to that. So the front of the field is side by side, but the middle and back of the field, there's starting to be some little dicey racing, and one thing I love about these shorter racing is there always seems to be movement from start to finish, and this race was no different, especially with the slingshot effect that I know Clint Boyer talked about on the actual broadcast. We always love to see that at the intense superspeedway races. And speaking of movement, by lap 3, Reddick, who started at the back of the field, moved to 6th, and that just goes to show how quickly things change at these races. Other interesting movers were cars that also moved backwards. Hamlin opted to bail from the draft, seemingly as a cautious choice to avoid some of this disorder near the front of the field. After Reddick moved up to 6th, there seemed to be a little bit of chaos for a fight for the lead. Hamlin eventually made it back to the top 5 by lap 23. Another driver who bailed from the pack was Alex Bowman. He did the same thing that Hamlin did. I believe it was a conscious choice, but he had car issues with around 30 to go. He thought something blew up in the car, the engine, so they had to bring it to pit road to take a look. Now, this is scary for the fact that Alex Bowman is your Daytona 500 pole sitter. Needing to change an engine could mean his pole position and starting in first place is completely gone, and he has to start from the back of the field. So with Alex Bowman having to pit around halfway, we're going to start talking about the pit stops here. With 27 to go, the Ford started the pit rotation, and during that, the Ford of Austin Cindric, who was racing his way into the 500, got a penalty for speeding on pit road. So, and I say this could have ended his chances for getting into the 500 after this incident brought him a lap down, but it did not, and I will explain why in a few minutes. The Toyotas then followed suit, and I found it odd that they pitted without the Fords or Chevys. They usually try to team up because they are a small but mighty army, and if they pitted by themselves, especially during the 500, which I hope they don't do this during the 500, could end up taking them away from the draft and leaving them by themselves. And finally, with 25 to go, the Chevys came in to pit. After that, we came down with 20 laps to go in the race. Hamlin moved to the bottom of the track after the odd pit strategy, trying to make something happen for himself. And with 8 to go, that line on the bottom that Hamlin started to make came in and the momentum hit, and that is when things started to get a little dicey. At this point, speaking of dicey, the 11 car of Denny Hamlin showed concerns over fuel left in the car. He did make it to the end of the race. I mean, it ended with him, I believe, on pit road having to push his car back to the garage or something like that by himself, but he made it to the end of the race with 3 wide racing. Here are the results for the finish of the race. The winner was Eric Almirola, leading 52 of these 60 laps. Now that is super impressive. He is a name that I don't believe is mentioned enough. I mean, I'm one of them. I didn't mention him enough in the podcast talking about the first Daytona Duel, but he is one to look out for. I was reminded when watching the broadcast that he got 2 of his wins, 2 of, I believe, the only wins that he has in the Cup Series at Super Speedway, so he is one that you should not count out for the 500. Another driver that seemed to win this race was Austin Cindric, who I mentioned had an issue on pit road for speeding. That did not matter because he raced his way into the 500, and this was controversial all over Twitter. So what ended up happening was Ryan Preece, who already raced his way into the 500 based on his qualifying time, finished ahead of all the other drivers trying to solidify their spots. Now, Ty Dillon finished ahead of Austin Cindric. He was not a lap down like Austin Cindric was, but didn't make it into the 500 because Preece finished ahead of Ty Dillon. I still don't really understand this rule, but if the guy who qualified the best already locked into the playoffs finishes ahead of everyone else, it goes to who has the next best qualifying time, which was Austin Cindric. So unfortunately, Ty Dillon was cut from the Daytona 500 roster, which I said, I don't like this rule. I think he got robbed. There was a lot of hashtags on Twitter, justice for Ty Dillon. Some of the drivers were even confused. Chase Elliott tweeted that he was confused about how this even happened, and even America's crew chief commented that this rule was kind of dumb. He didn't say those actual words, but kind of hinted towards that. You can see in the picture that I had with Chase Elliott's tweet that there was obvious disappointment from really good finish. Another driver who had a really good finish was Christopher Bell, and I was really skeptical. I've mentioned this so many times about him moving to the 20, but he showed incredible speed and control of the car tonight. He was in the top practically the whole time. So he's one that I'm going to start watching out for this season. I think maybe this change was a good thing. He's freaking talented. He has great talent. I just wasn't sure about this move to the car this soon. But now I'm not sure. I think he did a really good job, and I'm not going to count him out anymore. I think he has the skill. So ending with the first race discussion, we're going to go into the wilder race, duel number 2. I was very impressed with the intensity of duel 2. The second duel was filled with NASCAR heavy hitters. It was 6 past duel winners and 6 past champions, meaning lots of experience and lots of chaos, as the drivers can be a little bit more intense within reason. The chaos began before the race even started with a rain delay because it would not be NASCAR or 2021 without the season starting with some rain, but it was entertaining for multiple reasons. The past Daytona 500 throwbacks that we got to watch on the broadcast. They also played a Days of Thunder documentary, which I thought was really cool. I'd seen it once before, but it was really nice to watch it again with my family and point out my facts that I knew. They also had a jet dryer go down. The jet dryer apparently did not make a minimum speed on the high bankings of the Daytona track, and it just kind of slid off, and so that was a little bit of a mess, a wreck before the race. But after that rain delay, like I said, it was entertaining. The race started around 11:30 at night, and holy crap, I was tired. It was a little bit painful to stay up and watch, but the things we do for what we love, so I stayed up and watched the race anyways. There were several drivers to watch in this race, including the four trying to make their way into the 500 as like the Duel 1. There was drivers in Duel 2 trying to do the same. We had David Reagan, Kaz Grala, Garrett Smithley, and Noah Gragson. Second duel looked a lot more aggressive than from the start. I mean, Bubba Wallace started with the lead but lost it by lap 3 to William Byron. There were a lot more lead changes this race and a lot more movement. And the cars that moved the most, or seemed to move the most to me, were the four that are trying to make their way into the 500, which was impressive because these were either drivers that we've never seen in the Cup cars before, or drivers that we've seen in the Cup cars but don't seem to do a lot during the racing weekend. So I was very excited to see the spot for the crown jewel move back and forth several times during this race. And all the back and forth also happened between the manufacturers that started to find each other and team up with each other by lap 8. The Chevys on the inside line for most of the part, with the Fords and Toyotas in the mix on the outside. So at this point, it seemed like the Fords and Toyotas were going to work together, and then it got really confusing. Lots of cars tried to block near the front of the lines, costing them spots, like Wallace, who made his way back to the front, same with Chase Elliott, who tried to move into one of the lines and didn't quite make it. So with those moves, we've reached the halfway point of the second duel. The top 5 are Byron, Austin Dillon, Harvick, Blaney, and Keselowski. Now, halfway through the race, the drivers should be thinking about pit strategy, but they struggled. I got super nervous watching them just sitting in my living room. The drivers could not find their teammates. They couldn't find their like manufacturers, and they pit with their manufacturers for the purpose of when they leave pit road. It's harder if you go individually on the super speedways to get back to the draft by yourself, so they pit as a group so they can draft together and make their way back to the front of the field. And they just couldn't do that. And I thought that there was going to be a wreck because every time a driver tried to come down to the bottom line to make their way to pit road, there was a little bit of shoving and pushing that looked like it could have led to a wreck. But they were lucky that they weren't the ones that wrecked, because with 25 to go, there was a wreck at the back of the field that started a whole night of disappointments. Involved in this wreck were the 500 contenders, the hopefuls. Were in this wreck. We had Smithley, Kaz Grala, Alfredo, who went to the garage after this wreck, and Briscoe and BJ McLeod got into this wreck. And we restarted with 20 to go. Blaney is off first, then Harvick, Byron, Austin Dillon, and Truex. The lead was quickly taken by Byron, and Smithley held the transfer spot at this time. And with 4 to go, Smithley brought out the caution. It looked like he went for a gap between Keselowski, I'll play it here, and Gragson, racing for that spot in the 500, and then Keselowski seemed to come up when Smithley was already committed to making that gap, and it just did not work. And I know people were extremely mad on social media about Smithley making that wreck. I was a little mad too, but you have to also understand he had a reason to be racing so hard. He's racing for a spot on the 500, the crown jewel, the big event, the Super Bowl. He had a reason to race hard. Now, might have been a little misjudgment there, just maybe seeing if he thought he could fill the gap or not. So I'm not sure, but he seemed willing to wreck to make his way in if he had to. Unfortunately, in this wreck, Chastain was involved, Keselowski was involved, Gragson, the disappointment for me of the night, at least half of the disappointment, the Cinderella story, trying to get into the 500 for the team owner that passed away in January, did not make it. He went into the wall, but he did everything right. There was nothing he could have done. He was just mixed up in someone else's mess. Another driver mixed up in someone else's mess was William Byron, who was also on the front row. And I can't even tell you my disappointment with that. He'll be starting in the rear of the field. They couldn't fix his car. There was too much damage. He had to go to a backup. So after that was all cleared up, NASCAR overtime started. The field was led by Toyotas. Truex got moved to the middle after trying to make a block, and Derek Cope just kind of sat at the bottom of the track, squeezing the field together while Truex was trying to make the block, and I'm not sure if that contributed to him not being able to find somewhere to go, but he fell back quite a bit, and after this, it was a mad dash to the finish with Austin Dillon in the front row trying to block Wallace. He bumped to the door of the 23 and won the race by a hair. So Austin Dillon is your Blue-Green Vacations Duel 2 winner for the first dual win by the 3 car since 1999 after Dale Sr. came off of a 12-win streak for the Duels. So I think it was smart of Bubba not to throw a block back on the last lap. To me, it shows a little bit of maturity from him. I feel like maybe if last season or even a few seasons ago, he would have taken the opportunity to throw that block a little recklessly. But I don't know. I honestly don't know. I just am glad he didn't throw that block and ended up finishing the race second with just a few stripes of the car. But I thought he had it, so don't count him out for the 500. He has been impressive all weekend. But post-race, he was super hard on himself. He said he made a lot of mistakes. He really beat himself up. And I mean, I'm like that too. If I don't get the first place or the success, I tend to forget all the accomplishments. But you have to you look at this. He finished first in his first practice with a new team, a new owner, a new manufacturer from last season, and he qualified fourth. Now he's in the 5th spot for qualifying after the wins shook out, but God, it was so impressive, and I wish he could see that, take his head kind of out of the stress of the situation, and look at that. Other storylines here were Kaz Grala locked himself into the 500 for having the best finish after all those wrecks, and BJ McLeod was DNF'd with 14 to go. Here's what I took away from the second race. It was a little bit more of every man for himself than usual in these races. The manufacturer mix-up, they didn't really stay together as much. Also, more bumper-to-bumper racing. They talked about this during the broadcast, but they did slow the cars down a bit with the new package. They modified the downforce and horsepower, which I think helped these cars stay closer together and create more intense and seemed like safer racing. I also want to mention the drivers that impressed me the most. I mentioned Smithley for the most part. It was great to see him in the mix for the 500 spot. Bubba, like I mentioned, Bubba impressed me. And William Byron, until he wrecked out, was basically running towards the front of the race the whole time. He held his own. He was a strong competitor. And like I said, led majority of the race. So I think if he can make his way to the front of the field during the 500, he is also a very strong contender. So with those duels out of the way, let's bring it back to the 500 itself. Here is your new lineup. So with these races as well, it doesn't change my 500 prediction. I mentioned I think Eric Jones has a pretty good shot. And I'm going to say yes and no. I'm going to say no because the 500, like I said in my last podcast, is a crapshoot. You don't know who's going to be there at the end until the end. So I'm going to stick with my guy, Eric Jones, for winning the 500. And now we're speaking of winning the 500. Let's talk about winning the entire season, winning the championship at the end. I have not mentioned this yet, but I'm gonna say now my championship pick is Kevin Harvick, and I say Kevin Harvick over any other driver because he has been in the playoff for 5 times, tied with Kyle Busch for the most championship 4 appearances of active drivers. And I say Kevin Harvick over Kyle Busch because Harvick has consistency on his side. He has the same race-winning team and the same success last year to carry him over, so I think he will be your NASCAR 2021 champion. Also, it could change as the season goes on, but for right now, I think Kevin Harvick has a pretty good shot. So thank you so much for listening to Above the Yellow Line podcast, where we talk about all the updates, theories, news, recaps, and more of the NASCAR Cup Series. I am so sorry this video was a little longer. It was a lot to cover. We had a lot of lineup mixes. We had some news to break. We also had some championship picks and Daytona 500 picks to talk about. So next podcast, I'll be going over the 500 itself, and I'm really excited to get into that. So thank you so much for listening to Above the Yellow Line, and until next time, I'll see ya.